Hey, this is Mark Ryan coming at you with another video, and hopefully this one will challenge you to love Christ and think. And so I was looking for a video of Paul Washer talking about social justice, and it's hard to find. It's not a common thing he talks about. There's only one I could actually find, but he speaks to it pretty directly. And so if I understand it right, what's happening is there's a church, I believe it's in South Africa, and they're talking about a lot of the same issues that we have here in the United States. They're talking about, there's conflict between whites and blacks, and they're saying your fathers, wronged our fathers. They gained land unjustly, and we want compensation for it, not because you've wronged us, but your fathers wronged us. That's kind of the whole argument. And so they're talking to the Paul Washer because the conflict from the culture, from the country, it bleeds into the church. And so they're asking Paul Washer, hey, what do we do about this as it bleeds, conflict into the church? How do we handle this with wisdom? And Paul Washer is going to respond to him after they talk and tell the issue to Paul. So let's dive into this.
White minority privilege. So I don't know if you know about this whole land issue, where we want compensation of land or taking possession of land without compensation. And so that's on the political front, but in the church there are also black men that feel that white minority rich or privileged people are hiding behind gospel.
And so in South Africa, they were colonized way back in the day, and they have the issues that we're going through. And one was just over land. You've got land that was taken unjustly. We we want justice here. We want something to do. You didn't do it again. Your fathers did it, and let's keep going. I kind of repeated myself.
That's what they say, or love your neighbor, or you need to forgive.
And then when the whites are saying, no, our fathers did it, we didn't do it, and you should forgive, they're hiding behind the gospel in order to not do anything about it. That's what he's saying, and that could be a common charge, in America too. Hey, you didn't wrong us, your fathers wronged us, and you're hiding behind the gospel of, hey, you need to forgive, you need to get over it, just wait for heaven, you'll get justice in heaven. And so we even have the same conflicts here that they have in South Africa, and it comes into the church, just like it does in South Africa with this church as they're talking to Paul Washer.
They're hiding behind that, and that's why they don't want to give. They want to. There's this whole idea of you've got this beautiful big church building, drive a nice car, live in a nice neighborhood. I'm here in the township, and it's all because of your fathers, even though you didn't do it.
And we have that same exact thing going on with poverty right now, as blacks are saying, we're in poverty, you wronged us, you have all this nice stuff, we don't because you wronged us. And in Montana, we wrestle with this. Montana's pretty white, but we do have a lot of Native Americans, and that charge is there, as there's reservations, and, I'll hear from time to time, you guys wronged us, we want compensation. And they've been given some compensation, but they still feel like it's a drop in the bucket, and there should be more owed to them. So this affects Montana, this affects the United States as a whole, this affects, South Africa, any place, everywhere, because there's sin everywhere. Where there's sin, it's going to affect places.
All because of your fathers, when are you going to give back so that I can also have what you have? What counsel would you give pastors that have to think through these issues many of these issues has got real emotion attached to it, hurt attached to it. People that are still living today that is actually being kicked off their land. So.
And so if you listen to him there, people being kicked off their land, there would be a lot of emotion there, a lot of issues there. I remember Christopher Columbus Day is coming up tomorrow, and I remember back in college, I in the Student Life Center running around. It's Christopher Columbus Day. This would have been over 10 years ago. And I say to one of my native friends, Happy Columbus Day. And I won't forget, because it impacted me. He said, Mark, you want me to celebrate the death of my people? I mean, that's what came to his mind, and it was very real. There was emotion attached to it. It wasn't some distant thing that happened, 500 years ago. There was a real emotion attached to it, and we got to think these things through and be challenged to love Christ when we do think these through. Let's keep going.
How would you counsel pastors as they think through this, especially in light of the gospel?
Everyone.
And so what do you think Paul Washer is going to say there? Because you have the elders of the church, and they seem to be coming in a God-honoring way of, hey, what do we do here? How do we have good wisdom here? But if you're Paul Washer, how would you respond? What would you say to them? Think about that for a second. What would you say to them? Would you say, hey, that's in the past, get over it? Would you say, no, you really need to fight for justice there? What's your response to them? How do you counsel them?
One of the things that everyone's mentioning can be a problem.
He says everything that you're mentioning can be a problem there. I should mention too, this video clip I think is from about 2 years ago, so it's before the George Floyd, the Black Lives Matters, before all that movement really gains traction, really gains speed. Just for some context there too.
There can be a problem on one side of the lack of forgiveness. That's true. There can be a problem on the other side of hiding behind Christianity and not doing justice.
So he pushes back on both sides. There can be problems on both sides.
And both those things are true. And all those things are always going to happen. Because not in every case with every person, but they're going to exist in our world. This is another case where sin can result in problems. Temporal problems, but real problems.
And so Paul Washer just goes to, hey, this is a sin issue. Sin causes problems. We can expect these things. Anywhere there's people, we can expect these things. That seems fair. That seems pretty reasonable.
That seem almost to have no solution that's going to satisfy everyone.
And it seems like it'll have no solution that'll satisfy everyone. If you think of the United States, yeah. It seems like there's no solution right now that'll satisfy everyone. Because you think of reparations. Well, if African Americans get reparations, you've got this side. They're not happy about it. And then, if they don't get reparations, they're not happy about it. And so when we think through these issues, a lot of times it's, you can't make everyone happy.
A sense of, you have that land because your father did this to my father. There's some truth to that.
And so notice he says, hey, there's some truth to that. He doesn't just dismiss it. He doesn't say, yeah, just get over it. Look forward to heaven. Get over it. And I think that's a very valid point that Christians need to reinforce, that no, there's a valid truth to that. And we shouldn't dismiss it.
How do we fix that? That can also be a problem when this person whose father was robbed or killed or whatever, so that this other group would have this land. There's a problem then when he reacts in an unjust way, and may do the same thing.
And so, again, he pushes back on both sides. It's a sin issue, and both sides do react in unjust ways. That shouldn't surprise us. That should not surprise us at all.
In some cases, there must be recompense. And in other cases, there must be forgiveness. And then you throw rulers and leaders who do not have the Spirit of Christ.
More wisdom from Paul Washer. And then you throw in leaders who don't have the wisdom of Christ. And in the United States right now, I mean, that's what we're dealing with. We've got two leaders running for president. Neither one has the Spirit of Christ. And I'll argue that any day of the week. No Christian can stand up and say, Biden has the Spirit of Christ just running through his veins. No, that's not true. No one can stand up and say, Donald Trump, he has the Spirit of Christ running through his veins. That's not true. It's not true. And so when you've got leaders like that, it creates all these problems. They magnify them, and they see how they can gain advantage. I think Paul will go on to say this. They see how they can gain advantage and power and popularity by sparking up these divisions, by taking this one side where there's these hurt feelings and gaining a lot of popularity from them.
In the mix, who can gain advantage by riling up people on one side or the other, and you've got a mess. But here's what I think, that although a clear solution is beyond me as a person far removed from this problem.
And so he says, in a sense, there's no clear solution. I don't have it. I wish I did. And so, to a degree, that's wise too. I don't think sometimes the wisdom is saying, I don't have all the answers. I wish I did. I don't.
Our best hope to solve the problem.
Because if I could keep going on, as Christians, we don't have all the answers sometimes. Politicians will stand up and they'll say, yes, I've got all the answers. And do they? No, they don't. A lot of times fools will stand up and they'll rattle off their 1,000 words and they'll say, I've got all the answers. And no, they don't have all the answers.
Are men, gospel men, filled with integrity, who know that leading the country through this, that they're never going to be loved by everyone. Some people are going to think they did too much. Others are going to think they did too little. We need men of integrity who can work for this problem, realizing that in one sense they're going to kind of be martyrs. They're going to be loved and hated.
Yeah, they'll be loved and they'll be hated. That's definitely true, because if you take this side, one side hates you, and from what he was saying earlier, he basically says it's a case by case basis too.
But they're going to work it out, and those men only come from gospel preaching. Mm-hmm. Another thing that we have to do, and I hope this doesn't sound like a cop-out, but you remember when someone came to Jesus, tell my brother,
Yes.
he stole my inheritance. Jesus basically said, I don't care. The king.
Okay, that's interesting. If someone comes to you and says, man, there's been all this wrong, against me, and you say, yeah, I don't care. With the story of Jesus and the man that says, tell my brother to give me my inheritance, Jesus basically says, who made me judge over you? It's kind of a cop-out in this sense, but who appointed me judge over you? Why am I making that decision? But a big part of it was his heart was over coveting, over these things, over these worldly possessions, where like we've got the kingdom of God, we've got bigger things, as Paul will say. And so like our focus should be not just on stuff, on things, but we've got treasures in heaven stored up for us. And that's really what our life should be focused on, is on things that don't just burn or pass away, that don't, get moldy or rot, that thieves can't steal our treasures in heaven.
The kingdom of heaven has been given. Everything is yours. Everything is yours, he says. And so you're going to fight over this. That has to be kept in mind, okay?
And so we're saying, like, we don't leave it there. We don't leave it as you're fighting over small things when heaven is, we should be thinking about heavenly things. We don't just leave it there. We go look at the other side
At
too.
the same time, what has to be kept in mind is we're not just going to use Christianity to say, be content and wait for heaven. We're also going to work justice on this earth. I think one of the things...
And so that's the challenging thing, in my opinion. That's the challenging thing, is how do we work justice on this earth? And I think it's going to be on an individual basis, on a case-by-case basis. It's hard to get 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 1 million people all together at once. Normally, they're not saved. They don't have the Spirit of Christ in them. And so it's hard to get them all, to do a Christ-like thing. It's best doing it on a case-by-case, a person-by-person instance where people want, justice done, biblical justice done, with the Spirit of Christ.
That, instead of preachers preaching fighting and rebellion on both sides, someone needs to stand up and start preaching on the attributes of God. Why? Because you get to the book of Amos and he starts talking about social justice. And he starts talking about he's going to judge Damascus for this and Israel for this and on and on. And you begin, when people have a concept of who God is and they fear God, they're more prone to come to a solution.
And so, yeah, that's interesting. Paul Washer talks about Amos, and a lot of your social justice warriors they live in Amos, they go to that book because, as Paul Washer talks about, it talks about God judging nations because of the injustice upon their, that was dealt out, and God is angry over injustice. And we should be fearful over that. You think of America, we've slaughtered 60 million babies, over 60 million. And that's a dreadful thing. That's a fearful thing. And even the race thing with slavery and things like that, that's a dreadful thing. And it should never be minimized by anyone. Slavery should never be minimized by anyone. The oppression with African Americans, where they were basically second-class citizens for the longest time. That should never be minimized ever, in my opinion. And I'm right about it too.
Gospel preachers need to lament the problem. They need to pray for the problem. But they need...
And so he's offering pushback, honestly, right now. I feel like to both sides, there's balance there. A big thing lately with the Gospel Coalition, with a lot of Christians, is lamenting, racial injustice. And Paul Washer, he doesn't rebuke that per se in this video. Now with Gospel Coalition, they go down a bad path and adopt white fragility and the white savior complex and a lot of just... I listened to one of their lament nights, and They're talking about whiteness, white privilege. I mean, it was it was kind of just a critical race theory, night of lamenting. And so we do it in a biblical way. We can lament. But let's go on from there.
To realize that the greatest fix of this problem is the gospel. It really is. It really is. I know it sounds like a cop-out, but it really is.
And so Paul Washer is saying, preach the attributes of God. People need to know who God is, because when people know who God is, they fear God, because God is to be feared. And let's keep going.
It's keep preaching the gospel. And
preach the gospel. Paul Washer's not talking about the social gospel. He's not. He's talking about the gospel of Jesus Christ. That, it brings conviction of sin, and people cry out to God. And when people cry out to God and ask for forgiveness, because ultimately, I mean, all sin is primarily against God. And that's part of what the social justice movement, it just deletes that out of their false gospel. All sin is primarily against God. When King David sinned against, Bathsheba and had Bathsheba's wife murdered, committed adultery, King David writes Psalm 51, I think it's in there, against you and you alone have I sinned, O Lord, and committed what is evil in your sight. And so sin is against God. And when we fear God, we realize how severe sin is. Like, it's a big deal, and it causes hearts to change in how we treat other people. It changes.
Someone is in your church and they feel called to kind of rise up to do something for justice. Tell them, okay, don't crush them. Don't say no. Don't worry about that. Wait for heaven. Don't crush them. But you say, yeah, but you're going to do this biblically. You're going to love your enemies. Even if you have to take them to task on what's happened. You're going to love your enemies. We're going to make sure you're not moved by greed.
And so a lot of times, kind of what I see is people stand up for social justice and get really passionate about these things. And Paul Washer says, don't crush that spirit. Don't crush it. Let's do it biblically. And I've been reading a book by John Harris. The book is Social Justice Goes to Church. Just came out here about a week or so ago. And I'll be posting a book review on that, by the way. But the first 6 chapters are it's basically on pioneers in the social justice movement, kind of from the 1970s and so. But a lot of them, if someone took them aside and said, we're not going to crush your spirit for justice, we're going to do it biblically. Maybe that would have had an impact for them, because they get involved in social justice and it leads them off the cliff to apostasy, basically. It leads them in the wrong direction. And historically, social justice, social gospel movements, they don't end well. They end up with churches, with organizations abandoning the gospel and focusing on caring for the poor, focusing on, other things that are good things and noble. But when you abandon the gospel to do it, it doesn't really help others. So let's keep going. And
we're going to make sure you're just not a lazy person who wants to take over what someone else worked for.
That's right.
And if it's on the other side, sir, you need to realize there's a lot of hurt people out here. And no, you don't need to give away everything you have. But what can be done? What can you as a Christian do? A lot of times we want things to happen in mass. We want mass movements. So you want a mass of a bunch of unbiblical people to figure out this problem. It's not going to happen.
And so that's what we see in this country right now to a large extent, is we want the news media and just people in general, they want a mass movement, a big, large movement for justice, for social justice. And Paul says, no, That's not how we're going to get it. We're not going to get justice through a bunch of unbiblical people with no Christ spirit within them pushing for justice. It's going to end up in more calamity, more strife, more hurt feelings, more divisions. It's going to end up in more destruction when there's people without the spirit of Christ, pushing for all these things. And so let's do it, but let's do it biblically. Let's do it with a Christ, a Christ-like spirit. People with the spirit of Christ need to be the ones, leading the charge on these things. If there is actually going to be productive good to come out of it.
What the preacher does is go, I've got to work with individuals.
Not big movements, individuals.
I just got to keep them balanced. And if you're in a church and there's several black Africans, colored Africans that are really up in arms, you don't need to tell them, look, you just need to wait for your inheritance in heaven and sing this song with me. But you need to say, okay, your desire for social justice is good. But is what you're feeling in your heart and the strategy you're planning, is it biblical? Is it biblical? Is it right?
And so that would be a good movement, a good, thing for Christians to look into, is just doing social justice, if you want to call it that, doing justice biblically. How do we handle these things biblically, where there are these hurt feelings, and where sometimes, we say your treasure's in heaven. You're not going to get perfect justice in this lifetime. And then other times we say, no, there should be recompense here. There should be, there's two individuals and they can do something about it. There's a group of Christians and they're willing to come together and work together and do something about it.
What you're saying, is it true? Does it line up with Scripture? Because as long as we're working in the truth, we'll be all right. You see? Man, it's just, you see, when you take a culture, just about anywhere in the world, you take a culture and you destroy it, its recuperation is very rare. When I think about the judgments of God upon nations because of the social injustice, it's terrifying.
And so that goes back to just the attributes of God. God's holy, God's just, and when people aren't just, God gets angry over that. God's wrathful too, and He's omnipotent. There's no one that can say, God, what have you done? Away with you. No, God's all powerful and He does as He pleases. There's no one that can run from God after committing injustice because God's everywhere. There's no one that can hide the injustice that they've done because God knows it. He knows everything. And so knowing just the attributes of God, and I would throw in, Paul Washer probably would too, I'm sure, just knowing the attributes of man too. The depths of our radical depravity before Christ comes and saves us and gives us a new nature. Let's wrap this up. We've got, about 1 minute left.
It is terrifying. And although we need to wait, we need to realize that ultimately there is an eschatological judgment coming. When Christ returns, we're never commanded to just sit there and wait for that. We're to pray for kings and all who are in authority. We are to stand up,
So we can say, if someone says, don't worry about justice now, you'll get it in heaven. Paul Washer's basically saying, no, we shouldn't have that attitude. We should desire justice, good biblical justice, right here, right now, today, to a degree.
The matter of abortion, we can't just sit there and say, well, let's just wait till Jesus comes back. No, we're to cry out for those who cannot cry out for themselves. But we're to do it a biblical way. I know that doesn't give really any answers.
Addiction does.
All right, well, that should do it. And so, what did you think of that? If I could just talk a little bit more about that. I am going to start a series on Paul Washer. He wrote a book called The One True God, and it talks about the attributes of God. And so I'll be going through that, pretty much a Bible study on who God is. And it's a big deal. Who God is a big deal. And everyone could do better to think about the attributes of God more and who God is more. So I'll be going through that, and I'll also be going through the doctrine of man and who man is. And so that's probably my favorite Bible study, really. It's just the doctrine of man and God. And I know when I finished Paul Washer's book on that, The Doctrine of Man, I went from, on the fence. I'm an Arminian, but man, I'm really close to jumping the fence to Calvinism. By the time I was done with that book, I said, no, I'm a Calvinist. It describes, it was over total depravity, and I read through the verses for it and the argument for it in there. It's not even an argument. It's just it just puts forth, what Scripture declares about man. And by the time I got done reading that, I was like, yeah, that's true, that's true, that's true, and that's true. And so I'll be starting that here pretty soon. Check out those videos. And just my last thought before we shut this down is, I was out doing the census because I've been trying to earn some extra money. Actually, that bought a bunch of my YouTube stuff, is just working the census. And so they had me drive close to the Indian reservation, and I'm doing the census work. I pull over my car kind of in the middle of the road on an off-road, because there's no shoulder on the roads, a lot of roads in Montana, because it's Montana. We got a lot of roads, not a lot of people, praise God. But so I'm parked there. I might have had my turn signal on or something. And some Native Americans, they just, they pull by, they stop by, and I'm thinking, oh, what's going on here? Because I'm pretty close to the reservation. I mean, I could probably throw a rock, and there I am, on it. And I had to drive through just a small corner of it, just to get through. The road goes through a small corner of it. And in Montana, you hear stories and you hear people talk, and they say, the reservation's dangerous. Like, be careful, be careful, because there's still hurt feelings, from people there, and rightly so to a large degree. And so I'm there, and some Native Americans pull by, they're driving by, and the guy, he's got kids in the back and all that, and he says, hey, are you okay? Did your car break down? Can I help you? That kind of thing. And which I was thankful. My car hadn't broken down, and I was just doing census work, but it just went to show and remind me, there are still hurt feelings. And when I talked to people in the area, they kept telling me, hey, you got to be careful here, because basically because of the hurt feelings and everything. And if you're a Christian, in Montana, that's something that, if we have the Spirit of Christ in us, that's something that should give us, restless nights. Perhaps it should. That should give us something. We don't just dismiss it. We should think about those things. There are people that are hurt over that right now. And with the reservations, last thought, then we'll end the video. I was talking to somebody's God pastor, and he was saying, and he was part Native American too, but he was saying, socialism, like the purest form of socialism we have in the United States, maybe it's the VA, but really it's the reservations. And you see how it just destroys people. Socialism doesn't care for the poor, it creates the poor. And so the natives on the reservation, it's just destroys them, spiritually, emotionally, all those different things. They're sovereign over their territory. They're given, their money and everything. And it's done in a way that does not help them. It hurts them. And so, if you're a Christian in Montana, you got to think through these things. And it's the same everywhere. In South Africa and in the United States, we don't want to just dismiss it. And I say that partially because I think the woke movement, I think the social justice movement, I think it's a cancer. I think that it's rotten to the core. There's nothing good with it. You've got a bunch of unbiblical people doing unbiblical things, and they're incapable of getting any real justice out of it because the Spirit of Christ is not in them. But we need the people with the Spirit of Christ to talk into these issues, and so that there can actually be good that comes out of it. And so that's my thoughts. Let me know what you thought on Paul. Was Paul Washer right? Was Paul Washer wrong? What do you think? And just your reaction. The last thing I'll say too is that Paul Washer signed the statement on social justice that John MacArthur and a bunch of Christians, I think the Dallas Statement, that was signed a couple of years ago when the woke movement was just really gaining traction in the churches. So that should do it. I hope that this video challenged you to love Christ more by helping you think through this issue. And I will see you in the next video.